Good afternoon. My name is Ronan, Trainor, and I work with SmartBear Software, based out of our European headquarters in Galway, in Ireland. We're probably best known for Swagger and SoapUI. Of course, SoapUI was developed here in Sweden by a gentleman called Ole Lensmar about 12 years ago. He was our CTO for quite a while, and now he is an advisor on the board at SmartBear still, and still one of the smartest men I've met. So, what I'd like to do today, I was going to go through a number of different slides to talk about this, but I think it's a lot more interesting when we actually try and build something in 15 minutes, rather than going through lots of PowerPoint slides. So, the theme obviously today is how we're going to accelerate development, testing and delivery using virtualization. With API virtualization, sometimes our services aren't built yet, but we need them ready now. Sometimes we're working with third-party APIs that we're dependent upon, maybe as part of our CI pipeline. Maybe we want to do isolated load testing on our systems, and we're calling out to third-party services that may have rate limits, or we just may not have the access we need to them. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take a Swagger API definition. So we've designed an API in Swagger. Swagger has generated that documentation for me. And now we want to take it to the next step, and we want to create a virtual API from it and have it available straight away. Okay? So that's the end of my slide presentation. Yeah, I'm going to pop straight into, so this is Ready API. This is our tool suite. SoapUI, you can see up in the top navigation. So SoapUI is an open source tool, and we have a very strong relationship with our open source community. SoapUI will remain to be open source, and this is the commercial offering on top of that. So within Ready API, we have tools for automated testing, automated functional testing, load and performance testing, and then API virtualization, which I'm going to talk about today. So how do we create a virtual API? So we can do it in a number of different ways. We can create it from an API definition. We could record traffic from a live service and have that stand in for the actual live service itself. Or we can mock or prototype something up manually. I really like the ability to record traffic from a live service, because I used to run a lot of demos against Google Maps, and then I kept getting a message saying that I need to buy a developer license because I'm hitting it too often. So what I did was I recorded all the traffic I needed, and then I have a standalone version, limited version of Google Maps that will stand in for what I need. Okay, so my mouse should be working. I need a mouse mat, actually, or a sheet of paper, please. Thank you. That's perfect. No. Okay, there we go. That's better. Okay, so what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to use, so this is Swagger open source, and this is a pet store. And this is the JSON file that describes my API. And what Swagger does is it auto-generates documentation for me. So as a consumer of an API, I can very quickly go in, understand how the API works. I can send a request and get a static response back, like a mocked response. And as a consumer, this is fine because I understand how the API works and I can consume it in my own application. But sometimes we need to take it to the next level, where I want to be able to send a value of X and get a response of Y, or we need to put some logic around it. And using service V, we can do this. So if we just copy this, and as you can see, I can create a virtual service from an API definition, which we're going to do in this case. Okay, and we're going to go in and modify the service before we do anything with it. So now you can see from Swagger we have our different methods coming in here. So I'm going to work with this get pet by pet ID. Okay, so we supply an ID and we get a response back. At each method level here, there is a dispatch style. So a dispatch styles means that we can control what response is dispatched depending on a header, something in the body, or a value in the request. So if we look at get pet by ID, I have a response 1 here, which is in XML format. So when I'm designing my API in Swagger, I can put in models or example responses, and they'll be carried across into service V. So I'm going to edit response 2, and we're going to call this. No, we're not going to do it there. Interesting. I think I just totally X'd everything out of that. It's a live demo, folks. This is going to happen. An internet connection. Hang on, let's try it again. So this should be. I have full internet, so it doesn't really matter. Something freezing here. Try it again. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, if this doesn't import, I have one which I, like any good chef, have made earlier, so we can have a look at that. It seems to be, it's trying to pull in that live definition, which I'm not sure whether it's too many people are on the internet. Okay. Okay, so here's one I imported earlier on. So if we look at response 2, again, it is, it's disappeared, that's the first one. Okay. Okay. Now I have a valid response. Okay, I have only 6 minutes, that's all right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this to Nordic APIs, okay? And for response 6, I'm going to go in and actually say results not a valid ID. Everything's coming at me. Okay, so I'm going to run this service locally, right? So we've taken our Swagger definition, created our virtual service, and now I'm going to go back to my projects, and in my projects I have my Swagger pet store, and we have our interface and our operations and some sample requests. So if we look at get pet by ID, we're now pointing at the petstore.swagger.io. But we've only designed this API, so it's not actually developed yet. That's normally the case. So that service is generally not available yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to point to my mock service that we just created. And I'm going to put in a value and send a request. Okay? And immediately we get a response back from our mock service, right? As I continue to click send, we are sequencing through those responses that we carried across. Okay, so there's no logic there at the moment, but if I go back into service V, what we're going to do is put a little bit of logic around this. So depending on what's in the response, I could do a query match or an XPath match. If I want to do something really complex, I could use a Groovy script to maybe manipulate the request values before we decide which response we're dispatching. For this, however, I'm going to create a parameter dispatch style. And with my parameter dispatch style, I'm going to set response 6 to my default response, which is not a valid ID. And I'm going to create a simple rule, and the rule can be based on a query path or header. So in this case, if the path parameter of pet ID is equal to 2, then respond with response 2. So now we put a little bit of logic around it. If I go back to my projects and we fire a request with a value of 3, we get not a valid ID. If I pop a value of 2 in and send a request, we get that Nordic API as result, right? Now, obviously in service V, at each method coming in, we can create different dispatch styles. Maybe we're releasing an API iteratively, and we want to route some requests to the live API and some to mocked responses. We can control that as well. But the key point is we're taking a service that hasn't been developed yet, building a virtual API that's going to act in a similar way to the actual API itself, but it's available now. So if we think of a CI pipeline or some automation process we're working in, we need those services available straight away. So the key thing here is I'm now running this locally, okay, which is useful for me, maybe as a tester, if I want to start scoping my tests against a mock service in anticipation of getting access to the live API itself. But what I can now do is I can deploy the local service. So if we rename this maybe to whatever, Nordic's 3 minutes, excellent. Okay, so we now have we can imagine we've built up all the different dispatch strategies. Maybe we want to send a payload in our post request. We can certainly do that as well and dispatch certain responses. We can connect our responses to a data source. So if we have our test data, we can data drive the responses of the virtual API as well. And then I can simply drag and drop it down onto Virt server. So Virt server basically, if you look at the endpoint now, I've deployed it onto Virt server. It's a tool that allows us to share local services. And I can share this with potentially with consumers of my services, with testing teams, or with any system or user who needs to interact with it. Now, everything I've shown you is manual. As part of a CI pipeline, for example, I might want to pull a Virt server image from Docker Hub, automatically start up some services and run them as part of a pipeline and then tear that down afterwards. And there's various different ways we can automate all these processes. But to summarize, we're going to be able to speed up delivery. We're going to have access to the services that we may not have access to until maybe days or weeks down the line. We have that availability now. And hopefully that's going to enable us to start testing quicker, find bugs quicker. I could go back to my team in Swagger and say, we've done a little bit of testing, we need to make these changes. We can refactor and update the virtual services that we've created to keep everything in sync. And hopefully we can deliver our software that has less bugs in it faster. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope that it was useful and you got something from it.